Vertical composition in game audio generally tends to mean musical loop where each layer works harmonically with the others. And then a common approach is to use a gain parameter. In this case I've got fading, it's called here, and I'm fading in and out the different layers. So if I play this back and turn up the parameter, you'll hear the various layers appear. But using Fmod, we can also create vertical composition implementations without gain parameters. And the music that was just playing is an example of this. And we can easily do this by making use of the various probability parameters that Fmod offers for both transition triggers and for the actual instruments. And these settings can be found in the events editor. So here's a probability for a transition. And if we click on an instrument, we go to trigger behavior here, and under here we have probability and where we can set the chance. So the composition that we're using for this implementation is simply this piano loop. And the only difference between the intro and the VGM here is that this has been created as a seamless loop, and all of these are the same piece of music. So looking at how this has been set up in this implementation, in this first stage here, we'll go to the first loop and then we introduce the first change in the music. And then we'll go straight over to the second loop here, the VGM1, and this one will spin around. And the probability here means that there's a 77% chance that it will jump over to the second VGM loop here. And in the second transition trigger here, we've set it to a 66% chance that it will go back to VGM1. This way we can loop around these two VGM loops or these two sections with a constant change. In this case, these instruments here, we can also add probability to, so simply set on and then set a chance, and this way for every time it plays over this instrument, this will have a 74% chance of playing, and that obviously means that sometimes it won't play. As you can see here also, the various instruments have different starting point, and that's because I've based this idea on Brian Eno's discrete music and the idea of tape loops of different length. And to add to this also, I'm also using the start offset for each instrument. So where it starts every time it turns around is randomized using the start offset. So the various instruments have here different start offsets. And this way, in addition to have them sometimes playing and sometimes not playing, we also randomize where they start playing. And this way we get a great deal of variation. And finally, each instrument is also set to async, which means that it will play through the whole sequence, the whole loop, regardless how long this instrument is in the range. So here's an example of how async works. So in the first instrument here, async is off, and in the second one, it's on. So with the instrument set to async here, then the music continues even though the instrument itself only spans 2 bars here in the range. The second vertical example builds more on the probabilities that an instrument will play or not play, and he also introduces two additional instruments, the multi-instruments and the nested instrument. So multi-instruments in Fmod are similar to sample players, so we can have a large number of samples here or phrases. In this case I've got large drums, it sounds like this. And I can set the playback types. In this case, I've got it to random, but I can also have things like shuffle. And in this mode, it will play a different sample every time I press play. Like that. And of course, if I loop it around, so if I add a loop region to this, so loop region, I will set this out like this. And now every time it will loop back, it will play a new sample. So this is obviously very useful when you work with music, but also when you work with sound effects. We can also use multi-instruments to further manipulate sound. So here I've got a shaker loop. Sounds like this. Now, what I can do is I can use the multi-instruments to create mutes. So if we copy this and just paste it, and then I'm going to turn down the level of this particular loop here. And now when I play it back, muted, playing. So I can keep doing this also if I want to, so I can have more variations on this. So, and if I wanted to, I could also have level variations here, so I can have all of them play at slightly different levels. And because we're using the same loop sample, we're not taking up additional memory. So nested events are, like the name implies, events within events. And essentially, you can think about them almost like a session within a session. So if I just solo this and play it back, play this part. If we jump into this, double click on it, we can see that this is what it looks like. So I have this phrase here, which is split up in two sections. So it's the top end of this phrase, which sounds like this, and then there's a end phrase. And to create variation between the two, I have them in the multi-instrument. So here are top ones, and then we have the three end ones. And because they're set to random, they'll always play slightly different variations than this. I also have a longer of these phrases. Which has this end phrase going on here, and I want that to happen occasionally. So I have a transition marker here, and that is set with the probability of 67%. So obviously if I want this to happen more often, then I can increase this, or I can decrease it if I want to happen less often. So in playback, nested sessions are independent from your main session. So this one will simply loop around, then transition over, and then transition back to piano 1 again. And if we go back to our main session here, this will then loop around the duration of this event here. So I could, if I wanted to, I could drag this out longer, or I can make it shorter, and the nested event will loop around based on the duration of this nested event here. So they're very useful from that point of view. So this is obviously just one example of how you could work with this, and we could expand this if we wanted to, and we can add an additional loop here after this, or more if you want to, and just increase the amount of probabilities. So my clav here, for instance, has a probability of 47, and we go to the next one. And we can change this here or add to it. So we can set it here, we can have it a smaller probability, and the same idea with the other instruments. And that way, every time you're jumping between the sections, the probability of something will play will increase or decrease depending on how you're setting it. And of course, you could also set the probability for the transition markers. So I can have a couple more loops happening after this with more changes, and I can increase the probability that they will happen from a given point, or I can decrease it also. So as an example here, first loop here, I'm going to loop B here, but I could also add another transition marker here, and I can go to loop C also, and we can give that a probability of something. And that means that at this point here, not only can it jump to loop B, it can also jump to loop C. And from loop B, go back to loop A or to loop C, and then loop B to loop A. So there's a huge amount of variations you can do with the files that you brought in. And in this case, these are the files that I'm working with. So there's not a huge amount of audio either in consideration of how much variation we can get from them. So when you're composing music for vertical composition, it needs to be in the same harmonic structure. So you could, of course, introduce dissonance in it, but then that might clash because we don't know always what parts will collide with each other. So often when we think about vertical composition, we stay within the same harmonic family as it was.